Here on Toronto News Live, the case of a convicted child killer who manipulated the correction system. Terri-Lynne McClintic I became the subject of national outrage when it was learned she'd been transferred from a maximum security facility to an Indigenous healing lodge. A warm welcome to our special guest, Dr. Alexa Shevchuk, here with us today, providing insight on the sociological significance and controversy surrounding the McClintic case. Hi, thank you for having me. So this is clearly a very controversial issue. In context, we are seeing a shift in how we punish and how we perceive the prison system. This new penology is one dominated by understandings of rehabilitation and reform. And here in Canada, there are policies and practices in place aiming for our penal system to see more of a rehabilitative turn. And this is good. We have seen the detrimental and negative effects of incarceration. We know that the system is created to feed individuals through, primarily being minorities and the underprivileged. So it is no question that implementing alternative sanctions are beneficial for both the offender and the community alike. So why, when implemented, do we experience such community outrage? There's this question of whether or not the judicial system is doing its job. Is justice being served? So here in Canada, we do like this idea of rehabilitation. People are becoming more educated. They are understanding the risks of being caught up in the legal system. However, we enter this gray area once implementation actually affects ourselves. So we hear about these heinous cases, these heinous crimes, and they're often contorted by the media, oftentimes not, and we think to ourselves, lock these people up for life, they're not deserving of help. And this way of thinking is extremely controversial and contradictory. But in the case of, let's say, McClintic, we hear details of how she lured Tori as she was walking home from school. She bought a trash bag and hammer, having premeditated her murder. She even brought her back to her boyfriend's home so that she could rape this 8-year-old girl. So we hear these gruesome details, ones that are very close to home, and rehabilitation is just completely thrown out of the window. And understandably, it's crimes like these that evoke extreme moral outrage and grief. But the question becomes how, in cases like this, do people like McClintic receive the extent of rehabilitation and differential treatment? We question, what part does her gender status maybe have to do with this? Does her identity as a white woman have any determinate part in the treatment that she's receiving as an offender? How do her identities foster this, some would say, privileged position inside of the criminal justice system? How did she obtain this differential treatment? So as mentioned, we have this white woman who brutally murdered a child, spending her sentence in a Aboriginal healing lodge in Saskatchewan. She's being subject to minimum medium security with open concept living and kitchenettes. And we begin to question what factors placed her in such a position of privilege relative to those who committed similar or even less heinous crimes. And so we examine how our multiple identities intersected in such a way that created a singular experience unique to herself. So although it is possible to theorize that her preferential treatment is solely due to her sex, by using an intersectional understanding, we can see how multiple identities of McClintic's sex, age, and perhaps class can further exacerbate marginalization, or in this case, account for her privilege. So there have been studies conducted by individuals such as Leslie Kern. Her article called In Place and at Home in the City shows how white women feel safer in the city more so than in the suburbs. So Kern basically explains how their privileged identities of being white, able-bodied, and English-speaking facilitated in fostering feelings of easy mobility. So what's important to know is that, similar to the females in Kern's study, McClintic, a white female, had a colonialist sense of entitlement. She felt the right to be in a healing lodge designated for Aboriginals who had experienced years of intergenerational trauma. So not only does McClintic abuse the reparative programs designed for this heavily marginalized group, she feels the right to use them for herself and even self-identify as an Aboriginal. So these are things that, although some would say because she is a woman, in comparison to men in the criminal justice system, she's placed in a position of greater disadvantage. However, when we recognize her other identity as a white individual, we see how that places her in a drastically greater position of advantage. Hearing about a white female, a child murderer with a history of violence and sadistic motives, gets placed into a rehabilitative Aboriginal lodge. It's not hard to think of crimes very similar or even minimal in comparison that received significantly greater consequences and harsh punishment. So, Aboriginal lodges were implemented as a strategy for the Canadian government to try and curtail this overrepresentation of natives in the prison system. So, knowing that the prison itself is in no way going to aid in the healing of such a marginalized group, these healing lodges were created to help that demographic. The Aboriginal population, at the hands of the Canadian government, have experienced a long history of residential school, a history of sexual and physical abuse, poor education, a lack of nutrition, just overall trauma that through generations has put the Aboriginal population in a position of heavy and gross disadvantage. And we have this white woman, Terri-Lynne McClintic, who becomes a self-identified Aboriginal who feels the right to use these programs designed for a demographic which experienced trauma that she was at no point affected by. Further, the Government of Canada and Corrections Services feels the need to be politically correct and allow for a white woman to claim this disadvantaged identity of an Aboriginal in order to benefit herself, and the government allows it. So seeing how important it is to acknowledge these multiple identities and the treatment that's received as a result helps us understand this concept of systemic discrimination and how a white woman managed to use her identities and self-identified identity of an Aboriginal to receive privileged treatment that an otherwise non-white minority would not have that luxury. This entire case encapsulates the fusion of institutional discrimination and social prejudice in this complex web of relationships and structures that shape every aspect of our lives. Using intersectional perspectives, we can examine the ways that multiple identities work to create inequality and interlocking systems of privilege and oppressions. Great, thank you so much for your time.